Hello everyone, I'm Ali Plumb and I'm delighted to be your host for today's director panel as part of this year's BAFTA Film Sessions. This series celebrates the nominees from the upcoming BAFTA Film Awards. Some housekeeping bits though before we get started properly. You can join the conversation on social using hashtag BAFTAs, all one word of course. And if you have a question, and I imagine you will, but of course, then do pop it in the chat and we will come to it at the end of the discussion. We'll have a little Q&A bit there. We also have BSL available for today's session, and also captions are available by hitting the CC button at the bottom of the screen. So without any further ado, please welcome the speakers we have today as part of our directors panel. They are Edward Berger, director of All Quiet on the Western Front; Martin McDonagh, director of The Banshees of INISHERIN; director Park Chan-wook, the director of Decision to Leave. We also have Daniel Kwan and Daniel Scheinert, the directors of Everything Everywhere All at Once; Todd Field, director of Tar; and Gina Prince-Bythewood, director of The Woman King. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now that I've said the words director of so many times, it's lost all meaning. Here is an expansive, well-worn question to get us all started. For you, Martin, if you wouldn't mind helping us get things going. Where did the project of Banshees first arrive to you? How did it first come to be? What's its origin story?
Well, I think ever since in Bruges, I wanted to get Colin and Brendan Gleeson back together. So that's sort of been hanging over me for 14 years, I guess. And then I think maybe 8 years, I wrote something under this title that didn't quite go anywhere, and I kind of threw it away. But then I reread it about 3 years ago, and the first sort of five minutes or so weren't bad. And that's kind of the first 5 minutes of Banshees as is. In the previous version, it all went very plotty and like gunfights and just loads of crappy shit. But I chucked all that and just concentrated on a breakup, really, on a sad breakup, and kind of leaned into that and leaned into happily into a lack of story. So yeah, wrote that about 3 years ago, and it all came together pretty quickly. Sent it to Colin and Brendan. They said yes, I think over that weekend, and we set the ball running from there.
Edward, would you like to be our number two here? Let us know how All Quiet began for you.
Yeah, I got a call from my good friend and producer Malte Grunert, who said, if I got the rights to All Quiet on the Western Front, would that be something that would be of interest to you? And I thought, 2 times shit. I thought, first of all, why didn't I have the idea? And secondly, damn, I'm not going to get out of this for some reason. Yeah, so it's sort of just, I didn't really look for a movie like that. So I just took the idea home, and there were a lot of doubts about it. Should you make that movie, and why make that again, you know? And then but I realized very quickly that the book that I'd read when I was 15 and 22, that it never really left me, and that it just stayed with me. And then the real what tipped it over the line is that I went home and discussed it at the dinner table. And my kids are absolutely uninterested in what movie I'm going to do next. So they just get up and leave the table. But I mentioned the title, and this was my daughter, 17 at the time, whipped around and said, All Quiet on the Western Front. I just read it in school, which I didn't know that she read it. It's the best book I ever read. And I cried many times, and you absolutely have to make it. And then I knew kind of, you know, if a girl of 17 years, after 95 years after the publication of that book, it still has such an effect on it. And I recognized that effect that it had on me as well when I was 15. I thought I just, and then it was a done deal.
Yeah, that'll do it for sure. Todd, would you mind jumping in and tell us how Tar began for you?
Well, Tar began with this character. I'd sort of, been fortunate enough to make a living, adapting other people's work, and so it was a character I've been thinking about for an awful long time. But I kind of just figured she would, stay in a notebook. There was no place for her, and then I think, like a lot of us, that worked through the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a sort of feeling. I think people wanted to get back to work, not just filmmakers, but the studios as well. And so it's the only sort of way I have of explaining why Focus sort of said, write whatever script you want. We want to make a film with you. And so that was it. There was a vague sort of conversation with them that they were interested in something having to do with classical music and a conductor. But that was sort of it. There was no beating out of a story. There was no pitch or anything like that. And so I started, I don't know, the middle March, right at the beginning of the very first lockdown. And, it came very quickly, it came in about 12 weeks. I had a script, and I'd never written that quickly before. So.
I must ask at this point, though, at what point did Kate's name pop into your head?
Well, Kate's name, sorry, I'm on my phone and I'm getting all these texts. I don't know how to turn that off. Kate's name popped in as soon as I started. I normally, I think it's very dangerous to think about actors when you write, especially when you're adapting fiction, and you kind of want to, sort of keep a distance, a healthy distance from the material you're adapting, as sort of an amateur reader does. But in this case, she just kind of appeared, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but I didn't think she was going to stay, So, but every day I showed up, and I couldn't see anyone else. So by the end of the script, and when I turned it in, the studio said, "Do you have anyone in mind?" And I said, "No." Because I thought maybe they would call her, and spook her or something. It's very important how you approach a collaborator. And so I kind of futzed around for about a month, and then my wife said, you're not going to get anywhere this way. You're going to have to call her. That was a really, it was a moment fraught with terror, because had she said no, I honestly would not have made the film.
Yeah, well, there you go. Gina, could we jump to you and ask about the origin story of the Woman King, and also how quickly you got on the phone with Viola?
It's interesting that 7 years ago, I actually read a blurb in like Variety or Deadline that said that Viola was going to do a film about female warriors. And the first thought that came to me was, why didn't they come to me for that? But then they did, but to write it, because it hadn't been written yet, and I was on another project, so I was unable to take it on. But I said, please come back to me when there's a script. And how often does that happen? But they did. They came back 6 years later. That's how long it took to find a home at Sony for this film. And I remember reading it, and within 5 pages, I was seeing the movie in my head, and it was a historical epic that focused on African history, and it was something I hadn't seen before. I'd never heard of these real life female warriors, never heard of the kingdom, and it was just everything I had been wanting to do for years. I love historical epics. It's just an incredible genre, and to be able to tell the story of these women, again, it was everything I wanted to do. And then Viola Davis is attached, and she is greatness, and how often do we get to touch greatness? So our first meeting was incredibly inspired, and I don't get starstruck by anybody. Maybe Beyonce would be the only one, but I was, for some reason, starstruck meeting Viola, but she immediately kind of pushed that aside. And once we could start talking about the physicality of this character that she would need to embody, that's certainly a world that I knew more about than she did, and that gave me the confidence to really break down what our working relationship would be. But it was, it was just an incredible story. David Goliath, which who doesn't love that, and the innate heroism within these women and these warriors. And I just knew I had to tell it.
Well, quite so. Let's turn to you, Director Park. If you could tell us a bit about where Decision to Leave began.
예, 제가 런던에서 The Little Drummer Girl이라는 BBC 시리즈의 후반 작업을 하고 있을 때 너무나 한국이 그리워가지고 그 향수병에 걸려서 유튜브로 옛날 어렸을 때 내가 듣던 대중가요를 많이 찾아 들었어요. 그때 안개라는 노래를 접했고 거기에 꽂혀서 그 음악을 사용할 수 있는 이야기를 써봐야겠다고 결심했습니다.
So when I was working for Little Drummer Girl during the post-production, I got homesick. I really wanted to go back to Korea because I was stuck in London. And I was listening to old Korean pop songs from YouTube channel. And then I came upon the song called The Mist, which I used to listen to it all the time when I was little. And I thought I should use this song and develop into a story.
근데 그 전에 제가 경찰 영화를 하나 만들 생각을 갖고 있었거든요. 마틴 베크라고 하는 스웨덴의 경찰 소설 시리즈의 주인공인데 마틴 베크의 10권의 소설 중에 한 권의 한 챕터에서 영감을 받아서 새로운 이야기를 만들 생각을 갖고 있었어요. 근데 그것과 이 사랑 이야기를 그러니까 안개에서 영감받은 사랑 이야기를 이렇게 두 개로 합친다는 아이디어가 떠올랐습니다. 그래서 경찰 이야기이자 그러니까 수사 이야기이자 사랑 영화인 이런 헤어지 결심 영화가 탄생하게 된 거죠.
But even before that, I always wanted to make detective story and based on the Martin Beck series, Swedish detective series. And from the 10 book, out of that, one book and one chapter, I always wanted to develop that into a character, into a story. So with that and combining the romance element that I have got inspiration from the song called The Mist, I always wanted to, I thought about combining those two and making a procedural story and combine that with the romance story. And that is how the Decision to Leave came upon.
결과적으로는 그 마틴 베크 소설에서는 전혀 가져오지 않게 됐어요. 완전히 새로운 이야기가 만들어졌기 때문에 판권을 살 돈을 아낄 수 있게 됐죠.
But ultimately, what ended up happening was I didn't end up using any of the Martin Beck sort of elements. So that sort of helped me saving, having to spend money on getting the rights.
결과적으로는 그 런던의 우울한 날씨와 런던 사람들의 무뚝뚝한 성격이 저를 향수병으로 내몰았고 그것이 결국 이 영화를 탄생하게 만들었다고 말할 수 있겠습니다.
So what I can say is actually the somber weather of London and the somber, just the city of London that has sort of forced me into this longing and missing my home, getting a homesick, and that eventually led me to make a decision to leave.
Us Londoners are going to be very proud of that. So we take all the credit. Thank you very much. I'm of course kidding. The Daniels, could you jump in and tell us about the beginning of everything? I don't know which one of you would like to take the lead, but please.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty interchangeable, so we'll take turns. Like, I think most of our movies come from a collision of 3 or 4 different ideas that have a gravity that find each other. And so the first one is like the most simple and just like, just comes from a place of fun and joy and chasing the dopamine in life. And I remember I forget when this was, but we went to the New Beverly and Quentin Tarantino was having a 90s month and he did a double feature of Fight Club and The Matrix. And I remember just leaving the theater being like, oh my God, that was so much fun. if I could make something like half as good as The Matrix with, you know, the ability to be so entertaining and so philosophical at the same time, like I was like, that's my next thing. That's what we got to be chasing. So that was like the very like simple idea. And then on a more personal level, around that time, Turn Down for What had just come out. For those who don't know, we started in music videos, and we had just done a video for Little John and DJ Snake. And there's a lot to be said about that video, but one of the interesting things is I actually star in it. I'm the main character, and I run around doing very inappropriate things in the video. And what shocked me most about it was the discourse around the fact that I was an Asian American man in a rap hip hop video. You know, I guess it's more trap hip hop, but I remember being really embarrassed for a second, like, oh no, what did I just do? I oftentimes you know, we make small things for a very small audience, and so to suddenly see that get thrown into discourse was actually kind of unsettling. But then Phil Yu over at Angry Asian Man blog, which is like a prominent Asian American blog at the time, he wrote this whole piece about me being in that video and how excited he was to see a strong, sexualized man, Asian man in a hip hop video. And I realized, oh, the next thing we do, I probably want to grapple with my identity and my history and my family. And then, I don't know, Scheinert, do you want to talk about the last piece of it, which I think is kind
because it was my fault, you know?
Yeah.
I was grumpy, and I was like, I don't want to do a multiverse movie because, you know, the moment you introduce that concept, there's the whole concept is there's an infinite number of them. And I don't want to do, you know, a sci-fi movie that doesn't acknowledge the philosophical, existential, you know, thoughts that come from the premise. So I was like, we can't make a movie that goes to an infinite number of universes. That's like not makeable. And then Dan was like, what if we did? And so then that was the last ingredient, was like, we got really excited about that being something we hadn't seen before. Just kind of going to like chasing infinity with a movie.
Especially because the longer we lived with that idea, the more we realized it became like a perfect mirror to our modern existence, you know, just post social media, not even just social media, even just the regular news cycle, all of it feels like we're constantly touching infinity. And so once that all locked in, we realized, okay, this is media enough. We can spend a few years on this and never get bored. And we're still not bored of it. So that's it's a good feeling.
I love how you were just aiming to chase infinity. That was all you were looking to do.
Yeah, no big deal.
A bit of that. My next question again is for everyone attending today, but I was wondering, was there a scene in particular that you were perhaps preparing more diligently for, or obsessing over, or actively worrying about in particular before you actually got to shoot it? Was there a certain scene that really stood out to you as being, we've got to get that right? And Martin, as you may have guessed, I'm going to point my gaze at you. Was there a particular scene for you?
I knew, I mean, it's not particularly cinematic necessarily, but I think the whole essence of the story is when Brendan Gleeson says, I don't want to be friends with you anymore, to Colin. And I just knew we had to get that right, the sadness of that right. But because if that wasn't truthful or sad or deep, then it felt like we almost wouldn't have a film. But you know, it's all in the acting really, and in leaving room for it's mostly about Colin's response to the line. And so we had like I always have a few weeks rehearsal before we start shooting, to make sure we're all on the same page character-wise. And we were pretty much from the first days anyway, but I guess the subtlety of it comes through after a couple of weeks. But just the knowledge to allow Colin to take as much time in that reaction was what I knew that scene was all about, really. So as I say, it's not particularly cinematic or breathtaking visually, but I think at that moment really makes the film for me.
I was wondering about the difference between Colin and Brendan, their chemistry, how they work together. How had that changed from your perspective 14 years on from In Bruges?
It hadn't really changed at all, really. They you know, are as close as friends as ever before. I know that before they started shooting, they wondered if they might have to, you know, step apart and not be as close as they were on Bruges. But they quickly realized that wouldn't be much fun, and they were just going to act it. And that was a lot happier for me too, because it meant we could go out for drinks in the evening. Yeah, no, it hadn't changed. They're really supportive to each other, to the rest of the cast, to me. Just lovely people to work with. I recommend them to all of the directors here.
Double thumbs up. Edward, could you talk about a scene that stood out to you as being all important?
Well, I pretty much panic before every scene, I think, and the battle scenes were very complicated. And I remember a discussion with all the HODs and so forth, and my cameraman said, well, we'll all have shot battle scenes before, right? And I was thinking, I've never shot a battle scene before. And I've never even blown up a car on screen. Yeah, so I didn't know anything about it. But there was one scene which takes place in a crater where Paul, the main character, sort of falls, he stumbles and he flees, the battles are over, he flees, and he gets stuck with a Frenchman in this crater, and he stabs him. And then suddenly, you know, these kids, they've become survival beasts, you know, almost killing machines. And in order to survive, they need to kill. That's their only option. They need to eat, and so they eat voraciously all the time, or they kill others. And I think that's the first time where he realizes what he's become, and sort of stares death in the face and stares his, you know, lost soul in the face. And so it's a really important scene in the book. And so I knew I would, if I screwed that up, I would have a lot of hate and a lot of shame about it. And on top of it, again, it's my daughter. In that same discussion, in that first thing, she said, was one really good scene in the French crater, in that crater, the Frenchman, where he kills the Frenchman. And I thought, oh God, you know, now that has a lot of pressure on it. Definitely. And then, so I remember it was maybe 3 pages long in the script. And I had rehearsed it in the gym before because I wanted to get all the technicalities right and all the movements right. But I really then rehearsed it on the day in the crater, and suddenly it was 11 minutes long. And the AD and we had like a day and a half for this in the schedule. And the AD comes up to me and says, "Can you simplify? You know, because if you leave it like this, it's going to take 4 days." And I knew, because I had to shut one ear, you know, either that one where from the book and my daughter saying it's a really good scene, and my AD saying we got to make this in a day and a half. And so I shut the AD ear, and so listen, and then it took like 3.5 days, and we had to cut something else to accommodate for it. But I think I just knew that I wanted, and I also saw Felix's, the actor's performance in that crater, and I was so gripped by it that I thought, well, let's film it like he did it. Otherwise, you know, it's not going to be as good as in the book.
I'm sure Gina and yourself can share notes, and by all means do, about shooting battle sequences, but they must have been other.
But she shot battle scenes before.
Not like this one.
What were the big battle sequences that really were tricky to prepare for, Edward, as you got them on film?
Oh, me?
Yes,
or
please.
Gina? Oh, I'm sorry.
You can exchange
Gina.
notes, but that's fine.
What were the battle scenes that were tricky, you asked?
Yes. What were the particular ones that really stood out as, you know, this is going to take a lot of preparation?
I mean, I really had no clue how to make them, and very, very many times So I locked myself into a room with the DP also in lockdown. I flew him to Berlin. He's from London. And we stayed in this room and storyboarded everything. I took my iPhone and shot him on the floor, and as he reenacted, and he shot me with his. And then we put it all up on the wall because we also didn't have that much money. So we really needed to plan it very well. And then we put it up on the wall and re-edited it many times on the wall. And that helped us sort of find the right shots basically, and really knew what we needed to tell the story. But all of them, and very often I thought we planned this shot and he would come up with an idea. And I thought, oh, that's great. Let's write it down. And we drew it in little shitty drawings. I'm a very terrible drawer. But somehow you can translate it. So, and eventually, or I had one idea or something. And then eventually, about one shot that I really liked that he came up with, I thought like, and so how are we going to achieve it? And because it sounded impossible to get, to go through the trench and then sort of float out of the trench and then run 100 yards with the character and so forth. And he also said, oh, I don't know, So, and then, I mean, it was a great process of then discovering, we just sort of blocked everything out about technicality and just wrote down how we wanted it. And then eventually, once we had a crew and a team, we just asked about that particular shot, for example, the grips and the operator to help us achieve it. And then they didn't know either. So they need to do research. And so it's always interesting that you always find new challenges and that usually it's something new. Usually it's something that no one really knows. And then someone has to, call up, I don't know, someone from 1917 or from some other, or from Gina's movie and ask her, like, how did you do that? And then there's tips, and then suddenly you find a piece of equipment and then you find out, okay, this is the way to do it. And then we test it. And then eventually we all learned it.
I'm seeing nods of recognition from the Daniels in terms of improvised action sequences and trying to make something work relatively last minute. Is that ringing bells for you guys?
Yes, completely. I mean, the funny thing about our action film, it's fairly modest compared to anything you guys did, but all the inspiration comes from the Hong Kong action film industry, and the way that they do everything is completely improvised. For those of you who don't know, there's no script. Maybe there's a rough outline. Usually what happens is, and Michelle Yeoh actually told us stories about her showing up on set, and basically everyone would just figure it out on the day. And it's remarkable. They would shoot in sequence. Okay, we're going to go from this shot. Now we're going to go to this shot. And it was never about like block coverage or block shooting. It was always about, okay, what's the most exciting way to tell the story next? And so that actually really worked out for our benefit for our movie, because we had no time to shoot these action sequences. And the choreographers were actually just a team of guys that we found on YouTube. And we realized, oh, they are also super fans of Jackie Chan, Michelle Yeoh, Sammo Hung, the Hong Kong legends. And so there was a real scrappiness to it. Even though we had a legend like Michelle Yeoh, she, like, when she got on set and started shooting with us, she was like, oh, this reminds me of shooting in Hong Kong with my boys, So she was like at home, and it was actually really fun because Andy and Brian laid the choreographers, they would do a maneuver from one of her old movies, and she would instantly recognize which ones they were talking about, because they had such an encyclopedic knowledge of her work. And so they would just talk to each other through movement. And it was like, anyways, it was very fun just to witness super fans and the legend, the super cop, interacting in that way. And because of that, we were able to pull it off. Yeah.
Yeah, the benefit was that Michelle had a can-do attitude, The challenge was that those Hong Kong movies would shoot for like 100 days, like or more. Like they would just slowly get it, and we had to try to combine that with you know, a US based union shoot where we would try to bang out a fight scene in a day or two. And so it was a lot of collaboration between everybody to kind of crack that puzzle and figure out when to do it which way. And we were so afraid that we would do that our homage to Hong Kong action would feel cheap and like a real pale in comparison to the rest of Michelle's resume. But it took a team effort. And when we did pull it off, like everybody on set was like so visibly excited and relieved to be like, this holds up, you know?
Key was saying, I think just the other day, that the fanny pack fight was shot in one day with over 60 setups.
Yeah.
Incredible scenes.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask about a standout emotional scene, if that's the right term, that you were also focusing on and preparing greatly for?
Yeah, when you brought it up, I was immediately thinking of the parking lot scene is what we would call the kind of end of our movie, where the mother and daughter finally talk it all out. And in the schedule, it was one of the things that I was most scared of. Just that, like, it's a night shoot, and if we don't get it right, yeah, the movie falls apart. And I had a real fear of the actors getting worn out before we were done, and being like, oh, you know, now we're getting Steph Shu's coverage, but we've already done 30 takes pointing the other direction. What a cruel thing to do to an actress. And so we worked together to light it so we could shoot the entire scene in oneers, handheld, and so that we could get all Michelle, but not do too many takes, turn around and get all of Steph, not do too many takes, set aside a ton of time in case they got worn out, because it was a very emotional scene for both of them, obviously. Like, I wanted to be sure that we could, like, just step away for an hour if we needed, and try to pad the schedule and be like, let's get insert shots, like drink some water. And each, we did two shots at Michelle, 2 shots at Steph Shu. Every take was devastating and incredible. Like, our producer was crying at the monitor. And we were like, oh my God, we have it. And we wrapped a couple hours early. And that's the first time, that's like the only time in our entire careers that we've ever wrapped early. But it was, you know, just a testament to those actresses that they just did all their prep work, and they knew how important it was. And they just kind of like, yeah, just nailed it.
It's also worth noting that, because I know, Martin, you mentioned that you love to have rehearsal time beforehand, and we would love that too. But on this particular movie, Michelle is such a busy woman. She landed on an airplane maybe the week of shooting, you know, basically right before we started shooting. And so there was no rehearsal time. And so the fact that they were able to pull that together without ever actually running through the scene together once was kind of remarkable. But I do think a lot of this movie, you know, we owe so much to the fact that our performers were so ready, and so they had done the work beforehand, even though we hadn't had the time to all do it together. And yeah, though that night was really special for the whole crew.
Gina, let's hop back to you. Let's hear about a particular scene from The Woman King that was particularly important to you in terms of preparing for it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was, before Martin and Edward spoke, I was gonna talk about the oil battle, just because, you know, it's this huge battle, you know, within the film, and I only had 11 days to shoot it, this 11-minute war sequence, and it was like, how the hell was that gonna happen? But it is true, in really thinking about it, the scene that literally kept me up was the scene in the baths between Naniska, Nawi, Viola, and Tuso. That scene had to work. It's the revelation of their relationship and the depth of their relationship. And I remember that day, and, you know, we built this incredible bath, and thankfully Viola loves warm water, because she literally stayed in that bath for like 6 hours. But yeah, I knew what that scene was, but I was so tight that day. And normally, you know, I'm not. I mean, I love shooting, but it was because for me to take on this film, and as I talked about before, of course, of everything this film was, a historical epic and all of the beauty of shooting something like that. But what truly connected me to this film was the mother-daughter story and this guttural connection I had to that, and the truth of that. And Naniska Nawi's story of this young girl being born of a rape, was my own story. And that was something that I had infused into the script and into the dialogue. And so to watch this scene, it was like reliving my truth, which was something I had kept secret, honestly, until this film. And so I just remembered the rehearsals between the two women and being able to share what I could give to Tuso in terms of what that would feel like in that moment, to hear this revelation of where you've come from. And certainly, Viola, in our rehearsals, I shared a lot of some stories of women from Rwanda who had gone through that. Obviously, rape was used as a military tool, and so thousands of children were born of rape. And so to be able to share those stories with Viola, on the other side of it, I just knew an audience had to believe this scene. They had to feel the depth of the scene. And as soon as we did the first take, it's like all that tightness just went away, because the actors, they just understood it on a guttural level. And it was such an incredible thing to see these two feed off each other. And every take was slightly different because they were just truly in it and truly listening to each other. And it's an amazing thing to see your actors, if you're writing from a personal place, to embody your truth in such an incredible way that actually, honestly, shooting that scene was healing for me. So that was a big one for me.
Thank you for that, Gina. Director Parker, if we could turn to you. Is there a special scene for you that you were eagerly anticipating?
예, 당연히 마지막 장면이고요. 해변 장면입니다. 이때는 각본이 요구하는 조건이라는 것이 만조, 밀물이 완전히 다 들어오고, 그리고 그 바다 너머로 해가 지고, 또 파도가 아주 강해야 했기 때문에 이 모든 조건을 갖춘 날짜를 기상청과 의논해가면서 정확히 골랐고, 그래서 그날을 놓치면, 그날 못 찍으면 몇 달을 또 기다려야 되는 상황이었죠. 그래서 그때를 잡아놓고 만반의 준비를 해서 찍어야 했습니다.
So obviously it has to do. So obviously it will be the very last scene at the ocean, at the beach, because we had certain special conditions that need to be met. It had to be high tide, and over the ocean, the sun had to go down, and it had to have a very fierce, strong waves on the ocean. So we consulted with the National Weather Service to learn the specific date, and we had a very small window of a frame where we can achieve that. So we planned it ahead accordingly, because we had to get that right, or else we had to wait another couple of months in order to go back to it, and we could not do that, obviously.
게다가 물론 그 촬영은 성공적으로 끝났는데 그 찍으면서 멀리 그 남자 배우가 파도를 헤치고 뛰어가는 장면인데 그 장면에서 넘어지더라고요. 근데 그런 약속은 하지 않았는데 아마 정말 실수로 넘어진 거, 바위가 미끄러워서 그걸 2번이나 보고 있는데 저기서 떠내려 넘어가면 어떡하나 하는 걱정이 되긴 했지만 그 정도로 위험한 상태가 아니라는 걸 알고 있으니까 속으로는 좀 안심 반, 그러니까 걱정 반, 그렇지 않을 거야, 괜찮을 거야라는 안심 반, 그런 막 갈등을 하면서 계속 카메라를 돌려왔던 기억이 납니다.
Yes, fortunately, we were able to grab that moment successfully. But while we were shooting, the male character is supposed to run through the wave And we never had that discussed it, but by mistake, twice he would slip in the ocean. And I was worried because it was very high tide and a wave was fierce. So it was dangerous, but even though I knew it was dangerous at the same time, I knew it wasn't to the extent that he would it would be risky for his life. So I was halfway worried, and at the same time, I was a little relieved, or I was hoping to grab this very fortunate moment.
예, 그런 그 준비 과정에서 이제 긴장했던 건 그 장면인데 사실 제가 제일 공을 들이고 신경을 썼던 것은 사실 엉뚱한 다른 장면들이에요. 그러니까 대화 장면들이죠.
So that moment is the most and the scene that I had it really prepared. But actually, the one I was really focused on was actually the dialogue scenes.
언제나 그러니까 아무리 액션이 많은 영화를 찍어도 제일 신경이 쓰이는 것은 대화 장면을 어떻게 정확하게 찍어내느냐가 저의 제일 최대의 관심사입니다.
So even with the movie that has a lot of action sequence, for me, it is very important how I go about accurately capturing the dialogue scenes.
그냥 배우를 앉혀놓고 2대 카메라로 동시에 찍어서 나중에 편집한다 이런 방식이 아닌 정말 한 줄 한 줄 정말 어떤 때는 단어 하나에도 그것의 가장 정확한 앵글은 무엇인지 사이즈는 무엇인지 카메라 무브먼트를 어떻게 할 것인지 이것이 저 영화를 가장 영화답게 만드는 가장 중요한 일이라고 저는 믿거든요.
So it's not about just having two actors sitting across from each other and having a coverage from two sides. I don't think that's the way to go about it. For me, sometimes I go even line by line and even pay special focus attention to even a word. And I think about what angle should it be, or what kind of size for the frame should it be, or what kind of camera movement should would be the correct way to go about it. And I think that's the way, the basic element is what makes cinema a cinema.
그래서 더군다나 이해의 결심은 경찰 수사 드라마와 러브 스토리가 하나로 결합된 이야기이기 때문에 형사가 용의자를 신문하는 과정 이것이 이 두 가지 요소가 완전히 하나로 결합된 대표적인 장면이거든요. 신문을 통해서 수사도 하고 신문을 통해서 사랑을 전개해 나가는 데이트이기도 한 그런 장면이 두 개가 있습니다.
And especially for the decision to leave, this is a combination of procedural movie and also romance story. So even for the interrogation scene, it's a combination of the two. So while he is interrogating the suspect, he's also while he's interrogating, it's also about the process of him falling in love.
그래서 제가 만든 어떤 영화의 어떤 액션 시퀀스, 뭐 전투 장면 이런 것들과 비교해서도 가장 많이 생각하고 가장 많이 공을 들인 것이 바로 이 영화의 두 개의 신문 장면이었습니다.
So even with the action scenes and the battle scenes that I have made in past films, compared to that, those two interrogation scenes are what I have spent the most effort and put into great effort into making for the decision to leave.
Thank you for that. Todd, we turn to you. Haven't heard from you for a while. Please tell us a bit about a special scene within your movie that you were eagerly preparing for.
Well, that's a very tough question. It was a very challenging shoot on many levels, certainly for what Kate and others had to do. But other than 3 locations, we always had at least 1 or 2 company moves. I would say, first of all, I'd like to say hi, Edward. Hi there. We've only met on the phone before, but I'd like to just call out, Edward was a great help to me on Tar. I called him for some advice and for recommendation, who ultimately ended up being my cinematographer, Florian Hofmeister. And I also called Edward when I was really struggling to try to find a location for their residence. And he very wisely pointed me in the right direction.
I'm glad.
Yeah. And you know, the other thing, it's funny that you mentioned these trying to figure out the battle scene and how you would do it equipment wise, because I believe that we shared an operator in Danny Bishop. And so we were really struggling. This isn't the scene I want to talk about though, but we were struggling, you know, Florian and I trying to figure out how to execute this long classroom scene. And Danny really had a hand in that because he was talking about this piece of equipment that you guys use, I think, that was developed by the British military, but there were only four of them. And so we had to build our own rig with the grips, you know, to try to figure that out. But I guess that, you know, the scene that was really probably the crucible for all of us on this, you know, the film was really built for very practical reasons where we would save all of the orchestra material until the very end, so that Kate would have more time, and potentially, in sort of turns out wishful thinking, that we would have more time with the orchestra. But as it turned out, the Dresden Philharmonic, which agreed to cooperate and to play with us, only had a limited amount of time, and it was right at the top of the schedule. So all of the rehearsal time that I would normally have with the actors was really all about music, you know, and it was about getting ready for the very brief sort of 2.5 hour sessions that we had with the orchestra before we were actually shooting with them. And that was a really tough thing for Florian, really, because he had to figure out how to light sensibly 360 degrees. And we had to map out every single beat, every single phrase, where the camera would be. And that sort of approach to it was, you know, a lot of these rehearsal films that you see with conductors, and there's not a lot of those, but they're very passively observed with a couple of cameras and maybe a couple of boom operators. So, but doing it where there had to be very particular things happening dramatically at very different moments. The very first day we had to do 95 camera setups, and we could only shoot 10-hour days with a lunch break. So really we had 9 hours of shooting, you know, with 100 people that were not used to the circus, you know, and were, you know, very sensibly suspicious of us as filmmakers. And that changed over a few days, but that was a huge amount of our efforts and a lot of worry at the top of the shoot. And of course, when we finished with that 9 days later, there was no time to pat ourselves on the back because we still had 45 days of shooting left. So that was the equivalent of a battle scene in Tar. But I'm looking forward to seeing you in person, Edward, and shaking your hand, because you had a great impact on this film.
Thank you. That's great to hear. Very much looking forward to celebrating with you.
Yes.
I really want to find out, because I watched your movie and I had no clue how you made that classroom scene. And I really want to find out how you did it, because it's so precise and so mathematical that
I'll shorthand it, so I'm not taking all the conversation time. I'll give you the shorthand version of it. You know, it had to be in one. You know, it's the first time we see her stand in the film. It's real, except for when she's about ready to enter stage. It's the first time we see her move in her gait. And of course, it's about somebody that, you know, believes they control time until they don't, right? Until the end, when they have a headphone with, you know, a click track. So it was important that she control the editorial. So Florian and I talked about this for quite a while. And Barrett Meyer, who was our grip, kept trying to sell us on, you know, wires and things. Like, no, that's not going to work. And, you know, we had a couple situations where we were going to require a small techno and a super techno, and that wouldn't work. There was nowhere to hide, and you can't do it with a Steadicam, you know. So so in the end, we rehearsed for 2 full days, 1 full day alone with Kate, and then the guys came in, and then we we rehearsed a full day and then made adjustments. And then we had 2 days of shooting. Now, we had it on the first take, and at the very end of the take, someone who remained nameless had a little burp, and we thought, oh, that's fine, because look how we got that in one, you know. And then of course we chased it for 2 days and got out by the skin of our teeth. But in terms of how it was done, it's really done, you know. You ever seen I Am Cuba? You ever see that film?
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
yeah. So I mean, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. The amazing thing about that cinematographer and that director is they invented so many pieces of stuff that you couldn't just go down to the grip house and rent, you know, in trying to achieve a shot. And that was kind of what Barrett Meyer did on this, which is it was a combination of sort of a poor man's version of that head that you used on All Quiet on the Western Front, and then a platform built around it, you know, with speed rail, and we had 4 grips and stocking feet, and so 2 of them would hand it from one, 2 would hand it to the other 2, and then Danny and Florian and I were back, you know, outside that room, which, you know, is completely built in concrete, so very tricky times in terms of the remote head on that communicating with the gear head, you know, and that was a challenge too, because sometimes it'd be a little bit late, you know. And the idea was, you know, if you could have a perfectly, you know, if you could do 36 camera setups, which is essentially what Florian and I had talked about, and do all that coverage in one, letting her control the editorial, what would that be like? And so that was a real conversation, both with Danny, who, as you know, is also a Steadicam operator, sort of trying to talk to the grips and teach them, you know, how do you land, how do you start, how do you get over from A to B without getting caught, and having to, so they're dancing with Kate, but they're also dancing with Danny, who's in the in the other room on a monitor. So it was a very dangerous it was a dangerous setup, you know, and it's a 10-minute setup, so it was a you know, like others of you were saying, you know, it's one of those kinds of things where when you get it, you know, as Gina was saying, you know, you go from being very, very tight to all of a sudden, you know, you're jumping up and down, and it feels like you've won the World Series or something. It's one of those kinds of days.
We are starting to head towards the end of this session, but of course we have the Q&A portion to look forward to. So please, everybody watching, don't forget to pop your questions over to us, and I'll be sure to ask them. But maybe now's a good time to ask if anybody else has any questions to ask amongst the group. I obviously have noticed many people have that obsession is a key theme for a few of our films here, whether Martin and Todd have exchanged notes, or perhaps Director Park. But are there any questions you'd like to ask each other at this moment? Don't be shy, as they say. Daniels, I was wondering whether, you know, we talk about improvised stuff and finding cameras, and you've talked to me before about putting cameras on wheelie chairs to find your shot.
Yeah, we
했었죠, 당연히.
we love using the office chairs as like a poor man's dolly, at least when we're like testing out shots and stuff. We wanted to do the shot where Michelle flies into the closet all with a rolly chair, and then our grip department convinced us like they could do a really precise version that would look a lot better, and put a half of a chair on a dolly, but we still got to make it a little janky and use leaf blowers to like just have someone run behind her and leaf blow her hair and stuff, so it would look like she was going fast.
Yeah, I do think one of the weird contradictions to our style of filmmaking is, like, obviously we aspire to make great work, but then a lot of the stuff that we that got us into filmmaking in the first place was always very accessible. You know, Scheinert talks about the reason why he started filmmaking was because of Jackass. And again, like Hong Kong filmmaking, that's what my dad would have in the background in our household all the time. And you can see the wires sometimes. You can see the packs of dust that they'd hide in their into their sleeves. And so I think one of the things that we, you know, unintentionally have kept in our filmmaking, even as our budgets grow bigger, is like, how can we still add this feeling of there's the awe that comes with storytelling, and then there's the accessibility that comes with the fact that you can tell that it was just a bunch of friends making this together. I feel like, especially nowadays in a world where CG has made it possible to perfect everything, there's actually something really beautiful to see the human fingerprints in the filmmaking, even at a larger scale. So I love hearing about all this, like the grip rigs that you guys are building, like, because that's to me, that's like one of my favorite things about filmmaking. Is there's a Instagram account called Grip Rigs where you can submit like your custom DIY contraptions or whatever. And so, you know, Todd, if you take a picture,
I want to see it.
Yeah, if you take a picture of that rig, I really want to see it and put it on Instagram.
I can draw it. I'll draw it for you when I see you this week.
Okay. And then we'll send it to Grip Rigs. Okay.
Exactly.
I'll come up with a question. Like I feel like all these other movies are like very risky and brutal, and I'm just curious, like, if there was pushback ever on like on how I'm making an audience uncomfortable. I like love Woman King, and I like was shocked how visceral so many scenes were, and I was just curious if that was something you had to fight for, to be like, no, this is going to be more brutal than other historical epics, like, and that's the point, or what?
I appreciate that. What was the hardest thing was that going in knowing it needed to be PG-13. How do you?
Is it PG-13?
Yes, it is.
I didn't know that. Oh my
So
God.
how do you do a war film that's PG-13 and not have anyone walk away thinking, you know, that the action of the fighting was corny or not realistic? So, you know, hearing that from you is amazing. So thank you. Certainly, I've always known the power of sound, but on this, truly understood how much sound design can do the work for you, and how powerful an audience's imagination is when they hear something and actually don't see it. And there were a couple things we couldn't do. I couldn't show an actual, you know, cut of a throat, even though these women use machetes, and it was hand-to-hand combat. That was such an important part of it. That was a scary thing going in when they said I couldn't show that. So how can I do it? And so much of it was just being creative with the camera. Where is it where you actually don't see it coming across, but you see the start of it, where you see, you know, from behind the hand movement. And then our incredible design team, Becky Sullivan, who designed the sound, it was really building a soundscape that you literally feel like you're seeing things that you're not. So yeah, but thank you for that.
I have to ask you. Wait, I gotta ask you one. Wait. What about the fingernails, Gina? What about the very first thing? Did they give you any trouble about that at all?
The MPAA, that was one of the things they flagged, but I pointed out and we showed it to them again, that you actually don't see the fingers going in because it's right below camera. But it's, right, you know, again, how can we make it feel as visceral without actually seeing it? And that was with the sound and the blood, and of course Lashana Lynch's performance. But yeah, that was something that got flagged. But when you literally show them, you're actually not seeing the fingernails go into the eyes. They couldn't argue with that.
Yeah, but that's a compliment to you that it felt like you did, and that they felt that way when they saw the film, because that's how I remember it. The fingers went in the eyes and I saw it.
Well, this leads me to Martin. I wondered how long you spent talking about fingers making Banshees, and what sort of words were being used to make sure you got the props correct even.
Yeah, it was a big discussion early on, but I guess the solutions were quite quickly found. For the one finger thing, I think was just like a little green sleeve, which is always kind of comical, and for the rest of the fingers, when they all go, it was one of those kind of hand back contraptions, so you can see it, you know, from one side, and then the rest is kind of green fingers hidden. But Yeah, weirdly we didn't focus on it as much as we thought we would to begin with. I think a lot of those things is the suggestion of it is almost as Gina was saying, much more graphic almost, to not see it and just hear the sounds or sense of it, or where it cuts on the edit is we see it in here, but we don't necessarily have to see it all in the on film.
You mentioned the edit there. I was wondering whether we could all talk about the importance of the edit as part of your process and what it means to you to have enough time to get that done. If anybody would like to jump in.
Well, I'd be happy to jump in. I was really lucky to work with Monica Willey. She's one of the finest editors on the planet, you know. And you know, sort of the blessing and the curse of the lockdown is we had to be in a bubble, and we had to be in the middle of Scotland. And she's from Austria, and I'm, you know, from Maine, and we don't drive on that side of the road, so there was nothing to do but edit. So we edited for 7-day weeks, which meant that we actually ended up getting an extra 3 weeks of editing, and we needed every single day. And like Gina's saying, and Martin, which is sound is such a huge part of it. You know, sound is such a huge part of this film. And Mona showed up with a boom mic and a you know, recording machine, and so it was very quiet where we were. We ended up shooting a lot of Foley, which was very, very important and super useful. So we would send that stuff back and forth to Stephen Griffiths, our crack sound designer back in London, and we were able to get ahead quite a bit, probably a lot more than had we been, you know, kicking back in Soho or something like that. So that was hugely important. And I don't know that it's something that is I could ever replicate or would want to, but it certainly helped us a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly say I think we all know your relationship with your editors is everything. I'm blessed that Terry Shropshire, she's cut every single one of my films. So there's a 25-year relationship there, and the trust that we've built is just, I mean, it's everything for us. And for us, Todd, you talked about the 7-day weeks. For us, we got our release date moved up by 2 months in the middle of filming, and that was, I didn't have a choice. I mean, so I had to say yes, but that meant losing 2 months of edit time, and that compacted thing was scary a bit for a minute, but we all had to work 7-day weeks. It was, you know, 12, 13, 14 hours a day, but to have a editing team that was as passionate about this as I was everything. And I will say on the positive, in having such a shortened thing, we knew what we were doing, and we were putting it together, and we believed in the film and the edit. But it did, on a positive, leave less time for the studio to
right,
you know,
less previews, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
less notes, and so on that part, we were grateful for it. But you know, it was without the secondhand nature of our relationship and the trust that we have, I don't know that it could have gone as well, losing a full 2 months.
Director Park, if I could just jump over to you. Such a beautifully structured film, so intricately put together.
예,
How important is editing for you, and what does it mean to you for a movie like Decision to Live?
저는 스토리보드를 완전히 편집이 끝난 상태, 대화씬조차도 완전히 편집이 끝난 상태처럼 모든 샷을 그려서 만들어 놓고 촬영을 시작하기 때문에 편집이 이렇게 상대적으로 오래 걸리는 편은 아닙니다, 원래.
So I actually storyboard the entire movie, even the conversation scenes. So I don't take much of a time originally, even going to the editing, because I have thought of and boarded the entirety of the movie.
그런데 이번 경우에는 팬데믹 때문에 언제 개봉할지를 모르는 상황에서 시간이 주어지니까 자꾸 다듬게 되더라고요.
But this time, thanks to the pandemic, we weren't aware when the movie will be released. So I found myself kept going back to the editing.
그래서 결과적으로 제가 했던 작품 중에 가장 오랫동안 6개월 동안 편집을 한 작품이 됐습니다.
So ultimately, the decision to leave ended up being the movie that I spent most on editing, which was 6 months.
사실 이 편집자와 저는 아주 오래된 그러니까 일하는 동료 이상의 형제 같은 사이입니다.
So actually, with this editor and this relationship is more than a brother.
제가 첫 영화를 만들었을 때 그의 아버지가 에디터였고 그는 그 조수였죠.
So my very first feature, his father was an editor, and the editor for Decision to Leave, he was assistant to his dad.
그래서 저의 대부분의 작품들, 데뷔작 이후에 대부분의 작품들을 그와 함께 일을 했고 지금 Decision to Leave에서 조수를 했던 사람은 또 그의 아들입니다.
So the editor that I worked for the Decision to Leave, I worked with him ever since after the first feature. I worked with him for many years. And for Decision to Leave, I worked with his son. So I worked with 3 generations of, so his son worked as an assistant as well.
3대째 이 집안과 편집을 함께 해오면서 이제는 뭐 긴 대화 없이도 모든 것을 알아챌 수 있는 정도가 되었지만 그래도 그러니까 뭔가 좀 안일해지지 않기 위해서 늘 긴장하고 뭔가 도발하고 서로를 자극하고 논쟁을 촉발하고 그렇게 여러 가지 모험을 해보려고 노력합니다.
So altogether, I worked 3 generations of this family, editing family. So we are come hand in hand, and we don't need excessive conversation to know each other. But at the same time, we want to keep the tension, and we would argue intentionally in order to make a better film.
That's great.
That's a good technique. We have a question here from one of our audience. Sorry I've talked right over you, Daniel. I'm sorry. But this is a question from one of our audience. Wayne has asked, with the global political and social climate as it is at the moment, do you feel that there's a great responsibility to tell stories that address these political challenges that we're going through, make a social statement, and perhaps offer us some optimism and hope for a better future? And this question, I think, strikes me as maybe one for Edward, perhaps, because it is a film that you made, All Quiet, that is increasingly more and more relevant. How does that question strike you?
We obviously didn't make our movie as a comment on current wars. We made it because it's part of especially Germany's history. And it felt more like, I think all of us, seeing this group here, all of us seem to be filmmakers that want to tell a story that really comes from inside of us. And I think most filmmakers do. And so that story really came from inside of me in terms of dealing or talking about and sharing the responsibility that I think that Germany has towards history, and sharing that sense of, or putting that sense of actually using the movie as a funnel to put all that shame and guilt into the movie, and share that and say, listen, if we make a war movie, there's not going to be a hero. In the end, everyone is going to die anyway. So because there can't be a surviving German soldier, and there can't be someone, you can't have, from the British or American perspective, I totally get, or from other countries, I totally get there is some kind of a sense of maybe honor and pride with that part of history. And there's nothing like that in Germany. So you can't have someone, let's say on a mission, and be successful with that mission, you know, or someone kills someone else and go like, okay, great, that enemy is dead, you know, he's one goal closer to his. But to answer the question, so it's not a comment, you know, I find it very hard to be a messenger. In essence, we're filmmakers, and that's what we're trying to be good at, and sort of sharing a story that comes from inside of us, and everybody else who watches the movie, the audience, ideally they take their own interpretation. And if I had a message, I probably would say, don't listen to it, you know, because it's got to be your own. So in essence, I just want to make a movie and talk about primarily what's inside of me, and then hopefully it resonates with others.
Yeah. We don't have too much time left. I think there's time for just one more question from our audience. This is from Mark, and it's for the whole group. He says, thank you for the great conversation. And he was wondering, now that you have access to budgets which give you perhaps more scope and more potential, what now becomes the greatest challenge in terms of execution? He's curious whether perhaps it remains the script itself. Does that hit home for anybody?
That's definitely a great question for us. I think when me and Daniel started out, it was just me and him and a camera, you know, two guys in the camera, and we would just film whatever we could find. And from the very beginning, we were always trying to challenge ourselves despite our resources, and we'd always chase impossible ideas, or just ideas that we knew that if we didn't pull it off, we would fall flat on our faces. And so, like, even look at our first movie, Swiss Army Man. It was just we were trying to make you feel something for a farting corpse. It's like such an absurd and foolish thing to try to tackle, but I think those kind of things are the things that keep us interested and also keep us excited about working on these movies for a couple of years. And so Everything Everywhere, we were trying to make a movie that touched infinity, and that felt impossible. And I do think whatever we do next is we are always going to be chasing the sun, you know. I'm looking forward to seeing what movie is the moment where, you know, we fly too close to the sun and we fall into the ocean, but that hasn't happened yet, and we're very grateful for it.
Looking forward to it?
I'm looking forward to it. You know, I'm ready to be grounded, go back to my roots. Yeah, exactly.
We're going to green light Icarus the movie right now.
Exactly.
Gina, did I see that you were about to say something perhaps?
Oh, I would just touch on some great advice that I actually got from Ryan Johnson, who's a filmmaker that I respect tremendously. When all my budgets up until The Old Guard, the numbers were going down each movie. They weren't going up for some strange reason. But when I got The Old Guard, it was for a moment, damn, I've got 10 times the amount of money that I'm used to having. And Ryan was kind enough to invite me to his Star Wars set. And I asked him, how do you not get overwhelmed by the bigness of all of it? And he said, it doesn't matter how much money or toys you have. It's still always about the story first. And to be able to remember that, and I referred to that often in shooting, certainly The Old Guard and The Woman King, that it always has to begin with story. It always has to begin with the script. What more money does is gives you more time. But the beauty, I think, of many of us is starting with the smaller budgets and keeping that mentality. I hope I never get to a place where I'm like, you know, I do a scene a day and I'm good with that. Like, I like the energy of smaller budgets, because you're just shooting. So but that was great advice that he had given.
Okay, I think that may just about be it for our director's session today. Thank you truly so much to all of our speakers. Congratulations again on your nominations. We have some more fantastic online sessions taking place tomorrow, including the leading actress nominees hosted by some guy called Ali Plumb. So make sure you register to attend at BAFTA.org and head to the What's On section. And may I say, on a personal note, this truly has been an honor. So thank you, every last one of you. This has been a real pleasure, and I've learned a huge amount. Of course, let's remind each other that you'll have to tune in on Sunday, the 19th of February at 7 p.m. on BBC One and BBC iPlayer for the EE BAFTA Film Awards themselves, though I suspect those in this Zoom chat right now may be busy that night actually attending it. So thank you all for taking the time, both viewers and participants, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. This was great.
This is
Yeah, see
surreal.
y'all
Thank
Sunday.
you.
See you all soon.
Yeah.